Hi, sports fans. Rich Flaherty here with your Week 1 TFL results show. We're through the first week, and what a crappy week it was. It was awful, and for most of us. A couple of us were okay, but most of us were just awful. For the week, we only had one team that scored over 100, which isn't unusual for Week 1, but thank goodness we had the one score over 100, and we had five that scored over 80. I count that up. That's six. That means seven teams scored under 80. Let's go to the headlines. Week 1 was the second lowest scoring week ever in SOFA history to combined of all of our teams with 876 points. The lowest scoring week that eclipsed that was back in Week 1 in 2010 when there was only 859 total points scored. So at least we got that, at least we got that honor, not on 2025. Obviously, MVH was the outlier here with 108 points. Congratulations to Mike Von Hoven. And a related story, that 108 points that they scored was actually 3 points higher than the 105 points that our lowest scoring game of the week was of this game of the week this week. Only 5 teams, as we said, scored under 80. A whopping 6 teams scored under 70. So that's very winners and losers there. At least after last year's record 4 ties that we had during the year, we had our first tie this week, and it happened in a way that just cannot be scripted. I'll let you know what that is. 3 position starters, either quarterback, running back, wide receiver, or tight end, scored 0 points, including A.J. Brown and Worthy from the Chiefs. So it's amazing that that we got that many, but also that it was 2 high picks that in the draft that ended up scoring 0. And then a related topic: 11 total players in those positions, or starters in those positions, scored 3 or less. That's the most in a single week in SOFA history. What a train wreck. Let's go to the games. And game number 1 pitted Hootie versus Girls on the Beach. Both lines thought this was going to be a relatively high-scoring game. TFL actually called it our highest-scoring game of the week, and it did not live up to that luster. It was not a great game for either of these past champions. Hootie pulled out the victory with balanced scoring across the team. I'll bet it was very low scoring across the team. The loss really goes to Scott Beach, who made a surprising change where he benched his stacked players on the Jets, Fields and Wilson, and started Tua and Odunze instead, which cost them 31 points and the victory. Hootie wins the first game 75 to 56. Game number 2 was the Fat versus Share. Both lines felt that the Fat was in position to get their first victory, and CBS actually had this as the blowout of the week, and it certainly was not a blowout of the week, and it certainly was not a Fat victory. Share showed why CBS's draft score was correct, and they rode that strong, good scoring across the whole lineup, almost near perfect lineup, but not quite, to the second highest score of the week and an easy 88 to 83 victory. Game number 3 pitted Hang versus the G-Men, and here's one where the lines were split. CBS had this as a relatively close, low-scoring game for Hang. TFL had this as a relatively high-scoring game and a victory for G-Men. This was certainly not the yawner game of the week that CBS had projected, but it was, or at least not on G-Men's side of the house. Despite missing 18 points in Week 1 from their running back Williams on Dallas in the first game of the year, they got a big surprising week of 26 points from Patrick Mahomes to lead them to the blowout win of 86-53. Hang really had nothing to offer the entire game, getting double-digit scoring from only 4 of their 14 roster players, not just their starters. Of the roster players, only had 4 of them that got at least double-digit scoring. But the good news for Hang is they are not the worst team of the week, and we'll tell you who that is next. Game number 4 was ED versus That's Some Bad Hat. CBS and TFL both felt that this was going to be a close victory for ED. But this was some bad hat of a game. How bad hat was it? Well, of the 16 starters between the two teams, only 5 scored more than 5 points. And of the offensive players, so you take out the defenses from both teams, there was one player that scored 0, 3 players that scored 2, 2 players that scored 3, 1 that scored 4, 2 that scored 5, and 1 that scored 6. That's 9 players that scored a total of 32 points or 8 points less than Josh Allen scored all by himself. That is some freaking bad hat. And also, let's not forget at the draft, there was somebody who was saying, I didn't expect I would draft 3 wide receivers in the first 3 rounds, but they kind of fell in my lap, and was all excited about that wide receiver group. And certainly this wide receiver group is not going to be this bad all the time, but that wide receiver group of Chase, Collins, and St. Brown scored a total between the 3 of them of 8 points. And the key question from this game and overall is, how does Worthy scored 0 points when Patrick Mahomes scores 26 points? How does that work? He's got to catch at least 10 yards of passes. Very weird. But someone had to win this game, and as we said, ED won a nail biter, 56-49, which was less than what MVH scored. For the curious, because I know there was a question out there, that 105 total points scored by these two teams is low in SOFA history, but it did not even crack the top 10 lowest of all time. All right, we're on to game number 5. I guess TFL should have cared more about this game. As we said, this was our Who Cares game of the week. This was actually the highest scoring game of the week, mainly because of MVH. But it was a game that included 2 quarterbacks, Allen and Lamar, playing each other, scoring 69 points together. But the interesting stat in scoring in this game was that MVH scored 60 points alone from Allen and Zay Flowers. That 60 points actually beat 3 other teams in the league by themselves, and were on the heels of beating another 3 teams in the league just with those 2 players. The game was really over after the Bills-Ravens game, especially because of Halfway House's Bills defense getting 0 points. But Halfway House went more than halfway in staying competitive. Bad luck for them, as their 81 points would have beaten 7 other teams in the league, but MVH won this easily, 108-81. And then our last game. This is the game we mentioned earlier. It was No Way in Hell Hall versus Anya Huckleberry. Both lines thought this was an easy or a close victory by No Way in Hell Hall. But as we said, after 4 ties this year, the only redeeming quality of this game was that it produced our first tie of 2025. And as I said, the game came down it came down to the last play on Monday night, but it couldn't have been scripted. Get this. Going into the last play, Huckleberry was leading by 1 point. The last play of the game, Williams throws the ball to Odunze, who then laterals it to Moore. So now all the credit of yards on that play become Moore's, because he's the one who eventually gets tackled. He gets 13 yards in the play, which then moves him 2 points ahead, but then fumbles and loses the fumble, which is a -2, which drops him back down to this tie. So you couldn't have scripted it. It went from 1 point lead to 2 point leads, and then back down to a tie. And 2 more yards. That 13, if he got 2 more yards before he fumbled, Huck still would have gotten the victory by 1 point. But alas, it was just a tie. So there you go, guys. There's week 1. Hope you enjoyed the show, and we're going to try to do it via text this way. Hopefully this text goes through to you because it's not too big. And tune in later this week for our week 2 preview show. Thanks so much.